Have you ever had someone stand 3 feet away from you and call you a failure, while having absolutely no idea what you were actually worth?
Damn it! Damn it! You will always be a zero, Jamal. Nothing! That's all you've ever been!
You think I'm poor because I chose to live quiet. You never once asked me why.
Get off my property! Before I call the police!
What? What is this? Jamal, what is going on?
In 60 seconds, the entire balance of power on that street was about to flip, from a humiliated man to one addressed as Sir. But she had no idea yet. This was only the first layer of the truth. The lead SUV's door is about to open, and the man stepping out is about to erase everything she thought she knew about the failure she just threw out.
My name is Jamal Thompson. I'm 42 years old, and up until one bright Tuesday morning in Missouri City, Texas, I believed exactly one thing about a marriage: that the truest wealth a man builds is never the kind you can see from the curb. Then my wife threw my suitcase into the driveway in front of the whole street and told the neighbors I was worth nothing. That part you can probably already guess. Wives do that in these stories. What you don't know yet is this: 3 of the boxes she kicked across the concrete that morning were empty. On purpose, not by accident, by design. 2 weeks before Dahlia ever raised her voice, I had already moved everything that mattered out of that house, quietly, in the middle of the day, while she was getting her hair done in Sugar Land. What she was throwing at my feet that morning wasn't my life. It was the shell of it. And in exactly 11 minutes, 10 black SUVs were going to roll down that quiet residential street and stop, engines idling, right in front of her. Before we get into the story, I want you to sit with that image for a second. A woman standing barefoot on her own front porch, absolutely certain she's humiliating a broke man, while the truth is parked 3 blocks away waiting for a red light to change. Because what happened on that driveway isn't really about the money. It's about what happens when you decide a man's worth before you've ever asked him a single honest question. Stay with me. This one gets good. Now let me take you back to how the morning actually started, before any of the shouting. It was one of those flat, white-hot Texas mornings where the air over the driveway seems to shimmer even before 9 o'clock. Missouri City sits quiet most days, sprinklers ticking on timers, a mail truck easing down the block, somebody's dog barking twice and then losing interest. I'd been up since 5:30, same as always, drinking my coffee black on the back steps and watching the sky turn from gray to gold over the roofline of the Sweetwater subdivision. 16 years I'd lived on that street. 16 years of trash day on Thursdays and the Henderson sprinkler that always ran too long onto the sidewalk. I'd driven the same gray F-150 to job sites for a decade, the same truck Dahlia used to roll her eyes at when we pulled into her sister's driveway in Sienna Plantation. I never corrected her. I never explained. My father used to say, a man who has to announce what he's worth has already lost the argument. And I believed him. So while Dahlia complained to her book club about how some men just don't have ambition, I was quietly closing on contracts most people in that book club would never hear about. Some things you don't share until it's time. That morning, Ian, our 15-year-old, was already gone, dropped at the rec center off Highway 6 for early basketball practice. I remember being grateful for that small mercy before I even knew I'd need it. I'd just set my coffee mug in the sink when I heard the front door slam hard enough to rattle the window over the kitchen sink. Then I heard my suitcase, the good one, the one I kept in the hall closet, hit the driveway with a crack like a gunshot. I walked out onto the porch and found Dahlia standing there in her robe, arms crossed, chin lifted, already performing for an audience that hadn't fully gathered yet. My wife had always known how to work a room, even one as small as our own front yard. Behind her, more boxes waited on the threshold, ready to follow the suitcase down. "Jamal, you're a failure," she said, loud enough for it to carry past our yard and into the Andersons next door. "You're dragging this whole family down. I am tired of pretending to my friends in Houston that you're something you're not. I deserve a real man, one who can actually provide." Curtains moved 2 houses down. A neighbor watering her lawn let the hose run over her own feet without noticing. Somebody's phone rose up behind a window screen, already recording. Public humiliation, I've learned, always travels faster than any success ever does. I bent down and picked up our wedding photo from the pile, the frame cracked at one corner. And in that same instant, I clocked something small but important. One of the boxes she'd kicked open held nothing but old catalogs and expired coupons. Decoy weight. I said nothing. I just held the photograph a little tighter. "You will always be a 0, Dahlia said, kicking another box for effect, the sound echoing down the block. "Nothing. That's all you've ever been." I didn't answer her. I thought instead about 6 months of double shifts I'd taken on a pipeline job years back, quietly clearing $27,000 in credit card debt she never knew she'd run up. Debt she never once asked me how I'd paid off. I thought about turning down a regional director job in Dallas because she'd cried about leaving her mother in Houston, and I'd said yes that same afternoon without a second thought. My silence wasn't weakness. It never had been. It was preparation, wearing a very patient face. That's when I heard it. Low, steady, and getting closer. Not one engine, several, moving together with the kind of discipline that doesn't happen by accident. Everybody on that street turned their head at the exact same moment. So did Dahlia. So did I. If you think you already know how this ends, you don't. Not yet. Stick around, because the next 90 seconds are going to change everything you think you understand about the man standing quietly on that driveway. The engines didn't get quieter. They got closer. But Dahlia hadn't clocked that yet. She was still mid-performance, and a woman mid-performance rarely notices anything but her own audience. "You never once tried to give me more," she said, stepping down off the porch and onto the driveway now, closing the distance between us like she wanted the whole street to hear this part clearly. "Sharonda's husband bought her a house in Sienna Plantation, with a pool and a summer kitchen. Renee's husband takes her to Cabo every single year. And you," she gestured at our modest brick 2-story like it was an insult she'd been forced to live inside. "You kept us right here. 16 years in the same house, Jamal. The same truck, the same everything." Every comparison came dressed as a specific man's name. Sharonda's husband, Renee's husband, men she'd met at galas and christenings and Sunday brunches in Houston, men whose success she could point to like a brochure. My wife measured love in square footage, and she'd never once been shy about showing her math. I noticed, even then, that she never once compared me to a man's character, only to his zip code. I bent down again, careful with my knees on the hot concrete, and lifted a second photograph out of a torn box. Ian, maybe 6 weeks old, red-faced and furious in my arms in the hospital delivery room. He had my nose even then. I remember thinking, looking at that picture in the middle of all that noise, how much of a man's real inheritance never shows up on a bank statement. A thought moved through me clean and quiet. She thinks I chose to live small. She's never once asked me why I actually chose it. I thought back to a Sunday 2 years ago, right after church, when Dahlia stood in the kitchen slicing a sheet cake for the deacon's retirement and told me, almost offhand, that she was tired of explaining me to people.
I hadn't asked what that meant. I'd just kept drying the dishes, because some conversations you can already see the end of before they start, and there's no use rushing toward it. 3 years back, Dahlia had cried at this very kitchen table when I told her about a regional director position out of Dallas. More money, a title, a corner office with a window. She hadn't cried out of pride. She'd cried because it meant moving away from her mother in Houston. I turned it down that same afternoon. No negotiation, no resentment. Because that's what you do when you love somebody. I never once brought it up again. Not until this morning, standing in it, when the debt had apparently come due anyway. Down the block, the audience had stopped pretending. Mrs. Alvarez, 2 doors down, had let her garden hose run clean over the toes of her sandals, water pooling around her feet, and she didn't move an inch. A man on the Andersons' porch stood with his phone raised, but no longer angled at his own face. He was filming us now, openly, no longer bothering to hide it. Even the Freeman boy, who usually shot free throws against his garage door every morning at this exact hour, had let the basketball roll to a stop against the curb and simply stood there watching, forgotten. This wasn't gossip anymore. This was a show, and Dahlia was directing it without realizing the cameras had already turned on her, too. I've lived on this street long enough to know how fast a story travels once it leaves a driveway. By supper time, 3 different versions of this morning would already be circulating through group texts from here to Sienna Plantation. I understood that. I'd made my peace with it the moment I picked up that first photograph. A man's dignity was never going to be decided by whoever filmed the loudest 5 minutes of his life. "Get off my property before I call the police," she said, coming down the last step, pointing toward the street with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "I can't live like this anymore, Jamal. I won't." Her voice cracked right at the end of that sentence, just slightly. The kind of crack that comes from a person who is more frightened than furious and hasn't figured out the difference yet. I still didn't answer. There's a particular kind of power in a controlled silence, and I'd spent 16 years learning how to hold it. The angrier Dahlia got, the steadier I became, and something about that contrast seemed to unsettle the whole street more than either one of us shouting would have. "You think I'm poor because I chose to live quiet?" I finally said, low enough that it wasn't for the neighbors. It was for her. "You never once asked me why." She blinked, thrown for half a second by the fact that I'd spoken at all. Then she recovered, chin lifting again. "There's no why that explains this, Jamal. There's no excuse for—" That's when the sound behind her became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a delivery truck. It wasn't a neighbor pulling into a driveway 3 houses down. It was a low, coordinated rumble, the kind of sound multiple engines make when they're moving together, deliberately, unhurried, like nobody in those vehicles had ever needed to rush to prove a single thing in their lives. It rolled through the neighborhood the way distant thunder rolls before a Texas storm. You feel it in your chest before you can name what it is. Mrs. Alvarez turned first, hose still running over her feet. Then the man on the Anderson porch lowered his phone an inch, then raised it higher. One by one, the whole block turned to look down the street, drawn by that sound the way people are always drawn towards something they don't yet understand, but already sense matters. Dahlia turned last. 10 black SUVs came around the corner from the direction of Highway 6, moving in a slow, tight formation, sunlight sliding off 10 identical hoods like they'd been washed an hour ago just for this. They didn't rush the last stretch. They eased down our quiet residential street the way a funeral procession moves, or the way something moves when it already knows exactly how much time it has. One by one, they came to a stop directly in front of our house. Engines idling, doors closed. Nobody stepped out. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. Just 10 black vehicles sitting there in the Texas sun, patient as anything. Dahlia's hand, still raised from pointing me toward the street a moment earlier, slowly came down. I watched the color drain out of her face in real time, the anger draining right along with it, replaced by something that looked a lot more like fear, trying to disguise itself as confusion. "What?" Her voice had lost its edge completely now. It came out small, almost childlike. "What is this? Jamal, what is going on?" I stood there, Ian's baby photo still in my hand, and I let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable. 16 years of being underestimated does something to a man. It teaches him patience the way nothing else can. I thought about the neighbors with their phones raised, capturing every second of it. I thought about the version of this street that existed only 90 seconds ago, when Dahlia had been the one holding all the power in her own front yard. And I thought, quietly, to myself, she has no idea yet how long I've been ready for this exact moment. I didn't answer her question. Not yet. Team Jamal. A man owes no one an explanation for choosing to live quiet. Team Dahlia. No woman should be shamed for wanting more from a marriage that feels like it's standing still. Comment your team before those SUV doors open, because there's no fence left to sit on after this. The door of the lead SUV opened first. A man stepped out, tall, broad through the shoulders,
Great.
dark
What
suit
about the
cut
trunk?
close and
Got it.
clean. The kind of tailoring that doesn't come off a department store rack. Keith Pierce. I'd known him for 3 years, ever since I hired him to run security and logistics for the company, and in all that time, I'd never once seen him rush toward anything. I remembered the interview where I'd asked him what he thought mattered most in his line of work, and he'd said, without hesitation, "Knowing exactly when to move and when to wait, sir. Most men only know the first one." I'd hired him on the spot. He didn't rush now, either. He walked straight up our driveway with the calm, even stride of a man executing a plan he'd already rehearsed a dozen times. And he walked right past Dahlia like she was a mailbox. "Mr. Thompson, sir," he said, coming to a stop in front of me, hands folded. "We're here to collect you, exactly as scheduled." Then he leaned in, just slightly, and said something meant for only the two of us. "The backup files from the home office safe were relocated 2 weeks ago, sir, exactly as you instructed." I let a small smile settle at the corner of my mouth. Nothing dramatic, just a flicker. Dahlia hadn't caught the second sentence. It hadn't been pitched for her, but she didn't need to hear the words to understand what they meant. The math was already arranging itself behind her eyes. This wasn't a reaction to being thrown out. This was a plan that had already been in motion for 2 full weeks before she ever touched that suitcase. That's the first real twist in all of this, and I want you to sit with it a moment. Nothing about this morning was improvised. I hadn't scrambled to survive an ambush. I'd simply let one unfold exactly on schedule. Because I'd built the schedule myself. Behind Keith, 3 more men in dark suits moved up the driveway with the same unhurried precision, and they began gathering my belongings off the concrete. Not shoving them into duffel bags, but handling each item like it mattered. 6 of the 10 vehicles, I'd learn later, held my personal security detail. 2 carried a moving team Keith had put on retainer for exactly this kind of transition. The last 2 belonged to board members who'd insisted on riding along themselves, rather than waiting to hear about it secondhand. One man lifted our cracked wedding photo, wiped the glass clean with a cloth from his pocket, and set it gently into a protective case. Another knelt down and brushed the driveway dust off my old work boots before placing them into a garment bag meant for something far finer than boots. A third gathered the loose catalogs and expired coupons from that decoy box without comment, folding the empty cardboard flat and setting it neatly to the side, as if even trash deserved to be handled without disrespect. They moved like men handling things that were already worth something, regardless of what condition they'd been thrown in. Down the block, I noticed Mr. Reyes, who ran the little tire shop off Highway 6 and had known me since I first moved onto this street, standing frozen on his own front walk with his morning newspaper still rolled up under his arm. Forgotten.
He'd never once asked me what I did for a living beyond construction, and I'd never once corrected him. Some truths you let people arrive at in their own time, if they arrive at all.
Dahlia took a step back, one bare foot sliding off the edge of the driveway onto the grass. Her voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the woman who'd been commanding this street 10 minutes earlier. "This," she swallowed. "This is
You
what
have to trust
exactly?"
me.
It's not that simple.
I didn't answer
Please,
right
just
away.
listen.
I've learned that clarity, delivered slowly, lands heavier than anger ever could. I just looked at her, steady, the way you'd look at someone standing at the edge of a truth they aren't ready for yet. Keith walked to the rear door of the lead SUV and opened it.
Inside, cream leather caught the morning light, warm and soft. The kind of interior space Dahlia had only ever seen in the movies she watched on Sunday afternoons, never in the driveway of her own house. Down the street, the neighbors weren't pretending to look away anymore. 3 separate phones were up now, recording openly, nobody bothering to whisper behind their hands. 60 seconds. That's about how long it took for the entire balance of power on that driveway to flip completely. From a man being humiliated in front of his neighborhood to a man being addressed as Sir by a team that handled his cracked photograph like museum glass. I've thought about that 60-second window many times since. It's a strange thing, watching a lifetime of being underestimated collapse in less time than it takes to boil an egg. My wife stepped forward, closing the distance between us for the first time since she'd started shouting, and her hand came to rest, light and trembling, on my forearm.
"Jamal," she said, quieter now than I'd heard her in years. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve, then back up at her face. "The problem was never what you didn't know," I said. "The problem is how you treated me while you believed I had nothing." She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. There wasn't a version of that sentence that would have helped her, and some part of her seemed to understand that already. Her eyes moved past me, toward the open SUV door, toward the cream leather and the men working with such careful hands, and I watched her try to reconcile the man she'd screamed at 10 minutes ago with whatever this was standing in front of her now.
It's a hard thing, watching someone's entire understanding of you collapse and rebuild itself in real time. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Looking back, I understand now that her fear in that moment was never really about losing me. It was about losing the story she'd told herself for years, that she was the one who'd settled, the one who deserved more than this quiet life on this quiet street. The SUVs didn't just expose what I'd built, they exposed the fiction she'd needed to survive her own restlessness. Her hand on my sleeve wasn't reconciliation. It was a woman reaching for the one certainty she had left, in the exact second it stopped being certain. Behind us, the team kept working, folding, wrapping, loading, careful and quiet, and the whole street had gone silent enough that you could hear the click of a car door 2 houses down. Even Mrs. Alvarez had finally shut off her hose. I want to tell you something my father told me once, standing in his own driveway in a much smaller house than the one behind me now. A man's real worth is never announced. It's simply revealed, on its own schedule, to people who've earned the right to see it. And sometimes, to people who very much haven't. My father drove a delivery route for 31 years and never once raised his voice at my mother, even when money was tight enough that Christmas meant 1 gift apiece and a home-cooked meal instead of a restaurant. He used to say, patience isn't the absence of ambition. It's ambition wearing its work clothes instead of its Sunday best. I hadn't fully understood that lesson until I was standing on my own driveway, watching it prove itself true.
I stepped toward the open door of the SUV. The leather seat was cool against my back as I settled in. Through the tinted glass, I could still make out Dahlia standing there, barefoot on her own front lawn, arms no longer crossed, just hanging loose at her sides like she didn't quite know what to do with them anymore. Gregory, her father, would later tell me he'd been driving past on his way to the hardware store and had pulled over 3 houses down, unable to make himself get out of the car. I thought about that for a moment. How many times over the past year Gregory had mentioned, almost in passing, that his contracting business could use a man with your kind of connections, and how many times I'd let the comment pass without really hearing it. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I would before the night was over. The door closed behind me with a soft, solid click, the kind of sound that means something is over. But I knew, even as it shut, that Dahlia hadn't come close to understanding the whole of it yet. There were layers underneath this morning she hadn't even begun to touch. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I could already hear the question every person watching this must have been asking themselves right about now. What else has this man been hiding? And how much deeper does this go? Because trust me, we've barely scratched the surface. The door shut with that same soft final click, and the SUV began to move. Through the dark glass, I watched my wife grow smaller in the side mirror, barefoot, alone in the middle of our driveway in Missouri City, the neighbors still holding up their phones like the show wasn't over yet. In a way, it wasn't. Keith reached into a leather bag at his feet and handed me a tablet, screen already lit. "You'll want to see this before we reach downtown, sir." The screen showed a live video feed from a boardroom on the 40th floor of the J.P. Morgan Chase Tower, 600 Travis Street in downtown Houston. 20 people sat around a long table, waiting, patient the way people are patient when they already know their time is being well spent. Behind them, mounted on the wall in brushed steel letters, was the company logo, Thompson Infrastructure Group. Here's the second twist, and it's a bigger one than the first. This was never simply a story about a man who'd secretly saved some money. Thompson Infrastructure Group is a company I built from a single contracting job 17 years ago into a $9 billion infrastructure and renewable energy firm, developing solar and grid modernization projects across Houston and the greater state of Texas, with a particular focus on underserved communities that most large firms never bother building for. I still remembered the first job, rewiring a substation outside 3rd Ward with 2 employees and a truck that broke down twice that same month. Dahlia had heard the company name 100 times at charity dinners and church fundraisers over the years. She had simply never once connected it to the man sitting across from her at the kitchen table every night, the one she thought didn't have ambition. I'd let her believe that. It was easier, some years, than watching her recalculate what she thought she knew about me every time the subject came up. Keith turned the tablet slightly so I could scroll further. "There's something else you should know before the board call, sir. It concerns Mrs. Thompson." I read it once. Then I read it again, slower. 4 months ago, a man named Brandon Ellery had submitted a supplier contract proposal to Thompson Infrastructure Group, hoping to land a piece of our solar procurement pipeline. Our internal review team had flagged him. Inconsistent financials, 2 prior breach of contract disputes with other firms, a pattern that didn't sit right. I'd personally signed off on the rejection letter myself, months before I ever learned his name meant anything more to me than a line item in a supplier file. I remembered the file only vaguely at the time, one of maybe 40 proposals that quarter, most of them perfectly ordinary. His had stood out only because something about the numbers didn't add up, the way a crooked picture frame catches your eye in an otherwise straight hallway. Brandon Ellery, the same name Dahlia had been quietly seeing for 8 months. That detail changed the whole shape of it. 4 months into whatever they'd been to each other, Brandon hadn't just happened to submit a proposal to my company. He'd known exactly whose wife he was seeing, and he'd tried to use it, quietly angling for a foothold in a $9 billion pipeline through the one connection he thought nobody would ever trace back to him.
He'd been wrong about that. He'd also been wrong about how much Dahlia's husband already knew. I sat with that for a moment, the tablet warm in my hands, the Houston skyline sliding past the tinted windows outside. I thought about all the small excuses over the past 8 months. The book club that ran late on Tuesdays, the girls' trip to San Antonio that never quite matched the photos she'd shown me, the new perfume I hadn't asked about, because some questions, once you ask them, can't be unasked. My own wife's affair had, without either of them realizing it, walked directly through the front door of my company and been turned away by my own procurement office. She hadn't just betrayed our marriage. She'd unknowingly let a man with a documented pattern of financial dishonesty get close enough to a $9 billion company to try his hand at it, and lost, before she even knew there was a hand to be played. I thought about calling her right then, just to say the words out loud, to watch her face change through a phone screen the way it had changed in person on that driveway. I decided against it. Some truths land harder delivered face to face, later, when there's nowhere left to run from them. My silence for those 7 months wasn't mercy, and if I'm honest with myself, it wasn't restraint either. Some part of it was pride. I wanted proof of what I already suspected before I let myself feel the full weight of it. Because naming a betrayal out loud makes it permanent in a way that simply watching it never does. What I wanted in the end wasn't revenge. It was clarity. To know, once and for all, whether the woman I'd built a life with had ever really seen me at all, or only ever seen what I could provide. The SUV eased onto the ramp for the tower's private garage, and Keith angled the tablet camera so the board members could see me arriving. Celeste Whitaker, our senior board member, 62 years old and about as unimpressed by drama as any woman I've ever met, leaned toward the camera with a small, knowing smile. She'd been with the company 11 years, ever since I'd recruited her off a nonprofit board, where she'd spent 2 decades holding grown men accountable for budgets they hadn't bothered to read. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "we heard there was some excitement in Missouri City this morning." "Something like that," I said. 10 SUVs seems like a generous show for a man who claims he doesn't like attention, she said, and a few of the board members chuckled. "They weren't for me," I said. "They were for anyone who needed to see the truth arrive on time." Celeste tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was deciding whether to let a comment go or press it further. "And did it arrive on time?" "To the minute," I said. "Some things you plan for years, and they still surprise you when they finally land." She nodded once, satisfied, and sat back, letting the rest of the board move on to the morning's actual agenda. A grid modernization contract we'd been finalizing for a stretch of neighborhoods outside Fifth Ward that had gone without reliable power during 3 separate storms in the last 2 years. It struck me, even in the middle of everything else that morning, how strange and steadying it was to move from a driveway confrontation straight into a conversation about keeping the lights on for families who'd never once doubted my worth. I want you to picture it the way I did, sitting there in that back seat, a woman standing barefoot on wet concrete 20 miles behind me, still trying to process what she'd just watched drive away, having no idea that the story had already gone 1 layer deeper than she could possibly imagine. She thought she'd discovered I was hiding money. She had no idea she'd also unknowingly handed her own husband's rejected business partner a front-row seat to her own unraveling. By the time the SUV pulled into the private garage beneath the tower, my phone had already begun buzzing. A text from Ian's basketball coach, unrelated, about practice times. A missed call from Gregory, Dahlia's father, 3 attempts in under 10 minutes, which told me the neighborhood grapevine had already outrun me downtown.
And beneath all of it, quiet as ever, the knowledge that the hardest conversation of this entire story hadn't even happened yet. That one wasn't going to happen in a boardroom with board members and quarterly reports for cover. That one was going to happen at a kitchen table, the same kind of table where Dahlia had once cried about leaving her mother. The same kind of table where 16 years of a marriage had been built, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. I looked out at the glass and steel of downtown Houston catching the late morning sun, thought about everything still waiting to unfold that evening, and settled back into the seat. Whatever came next, I told myself, I wasn't going to meet it the way she'd met me that morning, with volume and an audience. I was going to meet it the way my father had taught me to meet everything that actually mattered, quietly, and with the full truth already in hand. The boardroom had been the easy part. Board members forgive a man his private life. They always have. What waited for me that evening was harder, because it wasn't a business reveal anymore. It was Ian, and whatever he already understood that neither of his parents had told him yet. Do you think Dahlia even knows yet who Brandon Ellery really tried to con? Or is that conversation still coming? Because tonight, it's coming. That evening, my wife showed up at my high-rise condo overlooking River Oaks. No makeup, no heels, just a plain gray dress and bare feet slipped into old sandals, like she'd stopped caring about appearances
sure about
somewhere
this?
between the
I
driveway
am.
and
It's under
here.
control.
And if it isn't?
She looked smaller
Then
than I'd ever seen her, and for a moment, standing in that doorway, I almost didn't recognize the woman who'd screamed at me on our own front lawn 12 hours earlier. The building's doorman had called up ahead to warn me she was on her way, and I'd told him to let her through without a word of explanation needed. Some conversations you don't make a person earn their way into. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table without being asked, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Behind her, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Houston skyline had already begun lighting up for the evening, indifferent to everything happening in that room. I've been seeing Brandon for 8 months, she said, before I could say anything at all. Her voice was flat, worn down to its studs. I thought your money was hidden somewhere, or dirty. I told myself that so it would hurt less to lie. I let that sit in the room for a moment before I answered. I've known for 7 months, I said. Her head came up sharply. What? The security team flagged the meetings months ago. Restaurants in Uptown mostly. I had it confirmed with photographs and receipts within a matter of weeks after that. I kept my voice even, the same voice I'd use walking a nervous client through a contract. I stayed quiet. I wanted to see who you'd choose once you believed I had nothing left to offer you. How? She stopped, started again. How could you possibly have known that long and said nothing? Here's the part that finally broke something loose in her. I told her about the old tablet. Ian still uses the tablet I gave him last year for school. Nobody ever removed it from the family messaging account you and I set up together back when he first got his own phone. The one that mirrors texts and call logs across every device on the plan, so a parent can always reach a kid in an emergency. You got a new phone in the fall, and never thought to check what was still connected to the old account. Ian noticed messages coming through that didn't belong to him months ago. He never opened them looking for anything. He just saw a name that wasn't mine, over and over, and eventually he understood what he was looking at. He didn't say a word to either of us. I paused. Until tonight. Dahlia's hands came up to cover her face. Whatever composure she'd walked in with was gone entirely now. It's one thing to be caught by a husband. It's another thing to learn your own son had been quietly carrying the truth for months, protecting no one, simply too heartbroken to know what to do with it. Her phone rang before she could respond. Her father, Gregory, calling for the 4th time that day. She answered it on speaker, hands shaking too badly to hold it steady any other way. Dahlia. Gregory's voice came through thin and unsteady, older than I remembered it sounding even a few months earlier.
I need to tell you something, and I need to tell Jamal too. I pushed you toward this. My contracting business has been underwater for over a year now. Bids I lost, a crew I couldn't afford to keep, a line of credit I let get away from me. I thought if you pressed Jamal harder, if you made him feel like he wasn't enough, he'd finally ask me for help running things, bring me in, fix what I couldn't fix myself. I told myself I was looking out for you. I wasn't. I was looking out for me, and I let you carry the shame of it. I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry. Dahlia stared at the phone like it had spoken a foreign language. I watched something in her face collapse even further. The realization that even the pressure she'd felt at home hadn't been entirely her own to begin with. That the voice she'd trusted most in the world had been quietly steering her toward a cliff the whole time. That's when the front door
You look
opened
so
and Ian
handsome
walked
tonight.
in.
Thank
He
you.
was tall
You
for
look beautiful.
15, still in his practice jersey, sweat dried at his hairline, a duffel bag over one shoulder. He'd clearly come straight from the rec center, no idea yet what he was walking into. And he stood in the doorway between his mother and me, and for a long moment, nobody said anything at all. The refrigerator hummed somewhere behind us. A car horn sounded faintly, 12 floors down. "Dad?" he finally said, voice cracking in that particular way a teenage boy's voice cracks when he's trying hard not to let it. "Mom, what did you do?" He looked at her, not at me, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around the strap of his duffel bag. "I heard what people are saying. Coach already asked me if I was okay before practice even started, which means it's already all over the group chats. But I remember who stayed up till 2 in the morning helping me finish my history essay 3 nights in a row last spring. I remember who never once said he was too tired, not one time in 15 years. You always said you had a headache, or a meeting, or you'd catch the next one." Dahlia's face crumpled entirely. It wasn't the affair that broke her in that moment. It was the sudden, undeniable knowledge that her own son had been quietly keeping score the whole time, and the final number hadn't come out in her favor. I looked at my son standing in that doorway, brave enough to say a true thing out loud in a room full of people who badly wanted to avoid it, and something in my chest loosened for the first time all day. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply tired and clear in the particular way you get once the worst of something has finally finished happening. Dahlia had no defense left to offer, and for the first time since that morning, she didn't try to build one. What do you think it takes for a woman to finally see clearly what she threw away? And is it already too late for her to fix it? We're about to find out. 3 years later, I stood in the ballroom at a charity gala in downtown Houston, and I saw Dahlia across the room for the first time in nearly a year. She looked different, steadier. Her hair was cut shorter now, practical, and she wore it without the same armor she used to carry into rooms like this. She'd started a mentorship program for young black women launching their first businesses, working out of a small office near the 3rd Ward. And word of it had begun to travel. Grant funding, a write-up in the local paper, a growing list of young women who credited her with helping them get their first loan approved or their first storefront lease signed. Whatever else had happened between us, I could see she'd built something real out of the wreckage. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. I'd spent a long time believing satisfaction would feel like watching someone lose everything. It turned out it felt more like this, watching someone finally build something true. Ian was there too, 18 now, tall and steady, interning at Thompson Infrastructure Group that summer before college, having chosen, without a single word of pressure from me, to walk the same path I had. He'd grown into a young man who noticed things, the way I always had, and said less than he saw. Partway through the evening, the program coordinator invited Ian up to say a few words about the mentorship initiative.
He walked up in a suit that still looked slightly borrowed on his frame, cleared his throat, and spoke plainly, the way his grandfather used to. "I want to thank someone who's been quietly supporting my mother's mentorship program since almost the very beginning," he said. "Someone who never once asked for recognition, never put his name on a plaque, just made sure the funding showed up every quarter when it was needed most." He paused, looked out over the room, and found me standing near the back. "That person is my dad," he said. "He's been doing this even after everything that happened between him and my mom. He never told her. But I knew. And I wanted her to know tonight. And I wanted to say thank you in front of everybody, because he taught me that the realest kind of help is the kind that doesn't need an audience." The room went quiet enough to hear the ice shifting in someone's glass 3 tables over. Dahlia stood frozen near the stage, one hand pressed flat against her chest, staring at me with an expression that had nothing left to hide behind. In that moment, she understood something all at once, that the very foundation her new life had been built on, the program she was so proud of, had been quietly held up the entire time by the man she'd once stood on a driveway and called a failure. I didn't say anything. I just nodded once toward my son, the smallest gesture, and let it speak for itself. After the program ended, Dahlia found me near the exit. Her eyes were wet, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "I didn't know," she said. "I destroyed everything, and you were still the one holding it up underneath me." "You didn't destroy what I built," I told her. "I just stopped propping up what wasn't worth propping up anymore. The rest, I kept building because it was never about you to begin with. It was about doing right by people who needed it." We shook hands, once, briefly. Not the handshake of 2 people rebuilding a marriage. The handshake of 2 people who'd finally arrived at something honest between them, which is its own kind of peace, even if it isn't the kind either of you originally hoped for. Ian stood between us afterward, smiling in that easy way young men smile when they've finally watched the adults in their life tell the truth out loud. Looking out over the Houston skyline through the ballroom windows that night, I thought about something my father used to say on our own front porch, years before any of this. Patience isn't waiting quietly for something good to happen to you. It's building something good, quietly, while nobody's watching and nobody thinks you will. This story reminds us that the truest wealth in a marriage was never the truck in the driveway or the house on the right street. It was never even about being seen. It was about what a person quietly keeps building long after anyone has stopped watching, and long after anyone even asks them to. If you're widowed now, and the recliner across from yours still holds the exact shape of a body that isn't coming back, don't wait for some anniversary or holiday to give yourself permission to feel it. Tomorrow morning at 7, pour 2 cups of coffee anyway. Hers in that chipped blue mug she carried home from a gas station outside the Grand Canyon back in '94. Sit across from the empty chair for exactly the length of 1 cup, no longer, no shorter. And say one true thing out loud that you never got around to saying. Then wash both mugs, dry them, and set hers back on the shelf where she always kept it. Do the same thing tomorrow. You're not performing grief for anyone. You're keeping an appointment with someone who mattered. If the house feels too quiet most evenings, don't just tell yourself the quiet will pass on its own. This Thursday, dig the recipe box out from behind the mixing bowls in the back of the pantry. Find the card in her handwriting, the one with the flour stain in the corner, and call your granddaughter or the neighbor's boy to come learn it with you Saturday morning. Use her old wooden rolling pin, the one with her initials burned into the handle. Let him make a mess of the counter. Let her voice guide the both of you through it, even though she isn't the one holding the spoon anymore. That recipe card was never really about the pie. If you're retired now, and some mornings you catch yourself doing the math on 30-some years of a career and coming up unsure what it actually added up to, don't sit with that question alone at the kitchen table. Walk into the volunteer office at the Children's Hospital or the elementary school this Tuesday and ask what a Wednesday afternoon looks like reading to second graders, restocking the library cart, or teaching one period of shop class a week. Put it on the calendar, in ink, not pencil. A schedule with somebody else's name on it is its own kind of answer. And if you're still carrying a grudge or a regret from a marriage that ended hard, don't wait around for an apology that may never come. Sit down tonight and write the letter you're never going to mail. Use the good stationery you've been saving in the drawer for no occasion in particular. Say the whole thing, the anger, and the parts you got wrong, too. Fold it once, seal it in an envelope, and slide it underneath that same box of stationery where you'll see it again someday. You don't need a reply. You just need it to exist somewhere outside your own chest. Worth was never something a driveway full of black SUVs could prove. And it isn't something an empty house can erase either. It just keeps showing up. Tuesday after Tuesday, mug after mug, recipe card after recipe card, in whoever still chooses to build something real, quietly, for someone else, long after anyone's counting.
Human writers poured their soul into these scripts to expose injustice and celebrate humanity. AI served as a technical supporter, refining expression so the valuable messages of equality, humility, and hope could reach and inspire millions.
Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.